Good evening and welcome. My name is Paul Dornan, and I chair the McClendon Scholar in Residence Council of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Since 2006, we have been sharing the legacy of the Reverend Jack McClendon with the Washington faith community, and now through virtual media to a far wider audience throughout the U.S. Reverend McClendon's intention in establishing this program was to bring the life of the mind, of the heart, and of the spirit together through the lasting presence of scholars from universities and seminaries, faith communities, the professions, and public life. Our discussion tonight would have been a special one for Jack, since he was also instrumental in the founding of Community Club, which is now celebrating its 60th year, offering one-with-one tutoring to the children of Washington's public schools. Each Thursday night of the school year, up to 100 pairs of tutors and students meet at the church to go over homework, to prepare for future school, and find themselves making lifelong friends across generation, race, and economic situation. For our invocation tonight, I will share the words of the American writer James Agee. Agee writes, "In every child who is born, no matter the circumstance, the potentiality of the human race is born. Each is a new and incommunicably tender life, wounded in every breath and almost as hardly killed as easily wounded, sustaining for a while, without defense, the enormous assaults of the universe." Please pray with me. Gracious God, we know that we are all remarkably fragile, yet somehow precious to you. Help us to imagine and bring into being a life together in which every child, no matter his circumstance, has the chance to make the mistakes and miscalculation that each child everywhere makes, and yet is honored in his uniqueness and offered an equal opportunity to share a hope-filled future. Amen.
Thank you, Paul. I want to say how much I appreciate your work, Paul, work you've done for so many years as chair of the McClendon Scholar Council. Paul leads a group of 10 members of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church who plan and help implement all of these programs. And all of us associated with the program are very thankful for the work that he and others in the council have done and continue to do. I want to add my welcome, say how pleased we are to have you here. We have almost 500 folks signed up for this program. And we know we have people from all over, not just the DC area, but as Paul said, around the country. We're just always glad to welcome people from both here locally and from far-flung places via the wonder of the internet. We like to see sometimes where folks are from. And I want to invite you, as I sometimes do, to go to the chat function. If you're not familiar with webinars, it's there at the bottom. You just click on chat and then you can type into it. And yeah, invite you to say where you're from. And if you're with a particular congregation, let us know. We have folks already from California and North Carolina, again, North Carolina. My goodness, someone from South Dakota. Charlotte, you can all see the chat as I do and see that we have not only a number of people from this area where we are at New York Avenue, but from around the country. We're just delighted to have all of you with us. Now, the McClendon Scholar Program, as Paul mentioned, has existed for more than 15 years, and we've had wide range of scholars on a number of subjects talk throughout the years. We've been blessed by all the brilliant scholars that have joined us at one time or another. One of the main topics we keep coming back to through the years and have looked at multiple times is the problem of mass incarceration and the inequities in our criminal justice system. Some of the prominent scholars we've had who discuss this issue include Dr. Dean Trulier of Howard University, Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative, Reverend Raphael Warnock talked about this issue when he visited us before he became Senator Raphael Warnock, and James Forman Jr., who wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book called Locking Up Our Own, was with us actually for 3 separate webinars back in 2020. So tonight we're pleased to welcome Professor Kristen Henning to continue our learning and discussion on this important topic. In a few moments, we'll introduce Professor Henning to you. She'll give a short presentation about her book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And then we'll spend most of the evening in discussion with her. We'll begin the discussion with some questions from Madalena Espiras. Madalena is a member of the Warner Memorial Presbyterian Church, and she is co-coordinator with me of the Returning Citizens Assistance Network. ARCAN includes 20 congregations in DC that work with the Public Defender Service to assist individuals who are struggling to get their lives in order after an encounter with the courts and the criminal justice system. Most of ARCAN's work is with adults, but we have had some cases referred to us involving children and youth, like the ones that Kris writes about in her book. We invited Madalena to engage with Kris because she has a deep commitment to assisting individuals, whether they be adults or youth, who've had encounters with the courts and the legal system, and in doing what she can to address the inequities that currently exist. After Madalena and Kris talk for a while, I will join again and ask some questions, including some of those I will draw from questions that you send in. In addition to the chat function, if you see there at the bottom, it's at the bottom on most screens, the Q&A function. And if as Kris is talking or in the conversation between with Madalena, she says something you want to ask her, please type it into the Q&A function. Now try to keep chat for just comments and sharing of resources, which we'll be doing at a few times, and then have your questions just in Q&A. It'll make it a lot easier for me to spot the good questions to ask. Keep them brief if you can, and make them as clear as you can, and I'll be looking at the questions as they come in, and I'll try to ask as many as we can in the limited time we have. Again, we're really pleased to have you with us tonight from all over the country, and we really look forward to a good discussion with Kris. I now want to invite Paul Dornan to introduce our McClendon Scholar for the evening.
I am pleased and honored to introduce our McClendon Scholar in Residence for this evening, Kris Henning. Kris has been representing children accused of crime in Washington, D.C. for more than 25 years and is a nationally recognized trainer and consultant at the intersection of race, adolescence, and policing. She was previously the lead attorney of the juvenile unit at the DC Public Defender Service, and now serves as the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law School. Professor Henning is the co-founder of a number of initiatives to combat racial injustice in the juvenile legal system, including the Ambassadors for Racial Justice program and a racial justice toolkit for youth offenders. She is also the recipient of many awards, including the 2021 Leadership Prize from the Juvenile Law Center. Kris has written numerous law review articles and other publications advocating for reform in the juvenile legal system. And especially tonight, she is the author of The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. Welcome, Professor Henning. We are delighted to have you in our midst.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Theo, for this invitation to be with you tonight. I have to tell you that I have attended many McClendon Scholars programs over the years, both in person and virtually. So it is a special honor for me to be here with you sitting in this seat. So thank you. I humbly thank you. A special shout out to my friends and family from Metropolitan AME Church. I see you there, and I'm so happy to be here. But most important, I am very moved that so many of you registered and that so many of you are here tonight to talk about this incredibly important topic: race, adolescence, policing, and the criminalization of Black youth in America. And so, as Paul said, I am the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic at Georgetown Law School. And before that, I was the lead attorney for the juvenile unit at the DC Public Defender Service. In total, in both of those capacities, in total, I have been representing children accused of crime in the District of Columbia for 26 years. But what is so shocking about that time span is that in that entire time, I have only represented 4 white children. That's it. Every other child that I have represented in the nation's capital has been an African-American child. That ratio, that statistic should cause every single one of us to gasp in horror, right? It might lead you to believe, for those of you who don't live in the District of Columbia, it might lead you to believe that either there are no white children in the nation's capital or that white children do not commit crimes. And I'm here to tell you that neither of those are true. And so it became hard for me, increasingly difficult for me to do this work, to represent children without wanting to know the answers to some really hard and important questions. Questions like, why do these extreme racial disparities exist in the District of Columbia and the United States more generally? And I want to be clear, this is not a DC problem. The raw numbers may look different, but the disparities that we're talking about are evident all over the country. I wanted to understand how these racial disparities are impacting Black youth mentally, physically, psychologically, developmentally. I wanted to know whether this disparate policing and disparate criminalization of Black children was making America any safer, or are we just hurting ourselves and hurting our children? And I really wanted to know, assuming that the disparities are not helpful and not justified, then what can we do about it? And so that's where this book arises out of, that set of questions: The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And I really think the best way to share what I have learned with you through the writing of this book and through my years, the 26 years of doing this work, is to tell you a story about a girl that I represented here in DC. I call her Charisse in the book, but Charisse was a 17-year-old girl who got into an argument with her boyfriend at school one day. They were arguing in the hallway, and during the argument, she became convinced that her boyfriend was cheating on her. And so she grabbed his cell phone out of his hand and began to walk away. As she's walking away, she's scrolling through his text messages to see whether or not he had been texting with some other girl. Now, a school resource officer, a police officer stationed at the school, sees this encounter and decides to intervene. his intervention was to arrest her. He arrests her in the hallway in front of her classmates. She gets held in detention overnight, brought to court the next day, and prosecuted for robbery. All right. Yet another moment where all of you should be gasping in horror. So now you've got this child who on paper looks like a serious violent felon when in fact she is a normal adolescent, a normal teenager, a normal teenage girl. And so whenever I talk about the prosecution, detention, and arrest of children, people automatically assume that I must be talking about serious violent offenses like rape, murder, car theft, carjacking, and real robberies, not the robberies that I just described to you with Charisse. But this is absolutely very far from the truth. Very few young people of any race and of any class are engaged in the types of violent crimes that we are most afraid of, and the types of violent crimes that we hear so much about in the media. Instead, juvenile courts across the country are populated by children like Charisse, who are engaged in some type of adolescent behavior, some type of behavior that draws from or arises out of the key features, the normal features of adolescence. I could ask all of you to jot in the chat, what are those key features of adolescence? And you would all tell me that teenagers are impulsive, reactive, they're emotional, they're sensation seekers, they're risk takers, they are fairness fanatics, right? And look, peer influence is not a myth. Teenagers do what their friends are doing. And actually, teenagers do what they think their friends are doing when their friends aren't even doing that, right? That's the nature of what it means to be a teenager. They don't think ahead to the long-term consequences. And they care more about the immediate rewards, right, than they do about the future and the future outcomes. But here's what's really important for our conversation tonight about the intersection between race and adolescence. And it is that research makes it clear that teenagers act like teenagers all over the world, wherever they live, right? Not just in the United States, but those key markers of adolescence are true all over the world. And so there's no good adolescence and no bad adolescence. There's no Black adolescence or white adolescence or Asian adolescence or indigenous people adolescence. Just adolescence is adolescence. And so that's what's really critical. Yet, racial disparities, notwithstanding the similarities that I just talked about, racial disparities are evident all over the United States, even as referrals to juvenile courts have gone down over the last 40 years. What we've seen is a widening of the racial disparities. So racial disparities are even greater, even as we arrest less children. And so another way to think about it, right, is that even when we get annoyed at this recklessness of adolescence, for the most part, we still treat white teenagers with tolerance, with grace, with compassion, with forgiveness, if not downright humor, in Hollywood movies, right? But at the same time, Black children are criminalized for virtually every key feature of adolescence. The clothes that they wear, the music that they listen to, sometimes even the way, young Black girls style their hair, talking back to adults, playing on a cell phone, having a party, coming home after curfew, experimenting with drugs and sex, and playing with toy guns in the park. Right? These are sort of the key activities of teenagers. All of us did these types of things, even when our parents didn't approve. And I could pull the thread on any one of those ideas to help us understand what I mean by the criminalization of Black adolescents. And so let's just take music for a moment, right? Think about how children listen to heavy metal, rock, country music, all with the same sort of violent and misogynistic lyrics that glorify drugs and alcohol with virtually no consequence. Black children listen to gangster rap, right? Or hip hop music, and it is treated as if it is the most dangerous music on the planet, right? Think about clothing, right? Think about the clothing that children wear and how much we as teenagers cared about the way we look. And so I think about tie-dye t-shirts and bell bottoms that were common in the hippie era and associated with what? Hallucinogens, right? And weed. I think about all Black attire and that straight Black hair that was common in the goth era, and that was also associated with mass shootings, right? We've never criminalized the tie-dye t-shirt or the bell bottoms. We never criminalized the Black, all Black attire. I also think about, quite frankly, these steel-toed Doc Martens with red shoelaces, which some white supremacist youth groups have claimed as their own, right? As their a form of their identity. We've never criminalized that. And you all know where I'm going. Think about sagging pants for Black children and the ways in which the sagging pants is the only fashion on the books in some cities across our country as a criminal offense. And I want to be clear, I have no desire to see a young person's underwear either, but is it appropriate to make it a criminal offense? Is it appropriate to create a scenario by which the law allows law enforcement to come into contact with the child because of the fashion that they wear? We uniquely set laws to criminalize Black adolescents. But even without a criminal law, think about the hoodie. The Black hoodie has become the iconic symbol of Black adolescent threat. And think about why that is, these markers of just normal adolescent behavior. And I have to say that even when Black children do commit real crimes, right? Even when they commit serious crime, the evidence is clear that we are also more likely to treat them as if they are beyond redemption, right? More likely to prosecute them as adults, more likely to find them guilty, more likely to send them to an adult prison with a severe sentence of life without the possibility of parole. They're more likely to end up in solitary confinement. These are what the range of ways in which we criminalize Black adolescents. And so then we have to ask our question, why is this? How did we get here? Right? Why is it, for example, that police officer responded to my client Sharice in the way that he did, and why are these racial disparities so pervasive? And so I always remind people, I often ask people to think back to Tamir Rice, young 12-year-old boy killed by the police in Cleveland, Ohio. And I ask folks if they remember what the police officer said in the media about why they shot him. Of course, they said there was a radio run, a lookout for a Black male with a gun. What people don't know is that the radio run, or the 911 caller at least, said that the gun was probably fake and that the person was probably a child. Right? There's debate about whether that information was passed on to the police officers, but the research shows that it actually doesn't even matter whether they had heard those last two pieces of information, because Tamir Rice is just, he's not alone. He is one of many children for which the police argue are a threat. And what the police said in that case was that Tamir Rice looked older. They kept talking about how he was weighing 170 pounds, standing 5 feet 7 inches tall, and wearing a size 36 pants and an extra large jacket. Right? Focusing on how much older he looked. And so apparently these officers could not see that beautiful baby face that we see in all the pictures. But Tamir Rice is not alone. Research shows that, and this is a really important piece for people to remember, that both police officers and civilians like you and me are likely to perceive Black youth and Black males in particular as significantly older than they actually are, more than 5.5 years older than they actually are. So that means that Tamir Rice looks to be 16, 17 years old, but like a 17-year-old Black boy, a 17-year-old Black client of mine appears to be, right, 23, 24 years old, right? The research also shows that adults also perceive Black girls in the same way. They perceive Black girls as being older, more knowledgeable about adult-like topics, more mature, right? Less in need of protection. Really critical points in understanding this criminalization of Black youth. The research shows that as a result of this disparate perceptions of Blackness and Black adolescents, Black children are significantly more likely to be arrested. Black girls are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested at school than white girls. Black boys are 2.4 times more likely to be arrested at school than a white boy. So there's so much research that helps us understand that. The other thing that I really want to drive home before we open this up to questions and conversation is that Black children are paying attention. Right? We have to ask ourselves, how many of you think that Black and Latino children who are similarly impacted are aware of the ways in which they are disparately treated in our society? And the answer is, of course, they are aware. Absolutely are they aware. And so when we think about sort of trauma, and we think about what young people today are living with, we have to understand that racial trauma, right? Racial discrimination is a source of trauma for Black youth. So when I ask that question, how are Black children impacted mentally, physically, developmentally, we have to remember that there is research documenting that Black children, there's a really powerful study coming out that came out in 2020, showing that Black children between the ages of 13 and 17 in a city like Washington, D.C. are experiencing racial discrimination 5 times a day. Encounters with racial discrimination 5 times a day. Experiences include being teased about their skin tone or their hair texture, being watched closely in a convenience store, noticing people lock their car doors or pull away on the street when they walk by, being made to feel like they're out of place. And what's really important is much of this research and much of the anecdotal stories that I tell in my book demonstrate that police encounters, or Black youth experience police encounters as another form of discrimination, racial discrimination that they perceive as such, that is intersecting with and cumulative with other experiences of racism in their lives, work, school, community, healthcare, and recreation. So, and understanding that these encounters with the police are traumatic. There is a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that young people experience in their encounters with the police. Research shows that Black youth who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods or who have frequent contact with the police, whether at school or at home or in their community, report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hypervigilant, meaning that they're always on guard, not trusting police officers. And what's so disturbing is that much of that distrust of police officers transfers over to other authority figures like teachers, counselors, other people who might be allies for the young person. What's so powerful about this research is also that trauma occurs not only from being the direct target of this type of police contact, but also from witnessing or hearing about police aggression among friends, family, someone that you're close to, or even from watching it on the internet and the television. And so I always say to police officers, look, this isn't an anti-police conversation. We have to acknowledge in our country that the blue uniform carries with it a history of tense race relationships between the police and African African American and other communities of color. And so that when young people watch incidents of violence and brutality, they experience post-traumatic stress disorder as if they were there. Right? On the one hand, becoming hyper aroused at watching these images, or becoming completely despondent because they've seen so many images like this. And so, I will conclude, by saying that really the research shows that the over-policing and the criminalization of normal adolescence actually increases crime in our society, right? The trauma, the residual impact of trauma actually breeds delinquent behavior. So we're doing ourselves a real disservice for those of us who want to have a conversation about public safety. And of course, I care madly about public safety, but that we've got to get it right. And that by over-policing and criminalizing and treating Black children differently than we treat other children in society, we are increasing instead of decreasing crime. And so when I talk with Madalena and Theo, I know we're going to talk about some of the solutions and what all of us on this call, on this Zoom can do. So I look forward to hearing your questions in the chat and from Madalena and Theo. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to make those opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Professor Henning. A lot to think about just in those brief remarks, and we appreciate the clarity and passion with which you talk about the concerns. The rest of the webinar is going to be a conversation with Kris Henning. And if you have questions, think about them and try to clearly and concisely write into the Q&A. Again, it's near the chat, but it's a separate place. If you have questions you'd like us to raise or for the group to ponder, go ahead and type those in anytime, and I'll be monitoring that. And as we begin, I want to invite Madalena Spiros, who I mentioned earlier, to begin the discussion with Kris, and I'll rejoin the conversation a little bit later with some of your questions.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much, Theo, for inviting me to participate in this conversation with Kris. And thank you, Kris, for taking the time to share more about your book and your experiences. I don't even know where to begin other than it's a lot. And I think that was one of the takeaways that I had from your book in regards to just the emotional and statistically overwhelming information that you shared and provided. And I can only imagine how it was for you to sit with all of this, see it obviously from your decades of experience, but then also to dig deeper into some of the roots. And as you said, contributing arteries that are feeding this monster that we've become too familiar with, right? So I appreciate, at least from my perspective, how you built the book. And maybe that was intentional to kind of wade us into the water, right? Versus throwing us into the deep end with these, very difficult and challenging conversations, as well as statistics. And so as I was reading it, I felt like I was going deeper and, into darker. And as you mentioned, just kind of reliving some of those traumas that we've seen and heard, and even maybe some of us have experienced, right? So you lifted us back up and out with the end of your book, talking about those solutions and the hope that you've seen from your clients. So I wanted to ask, as an original or starting question, in regards to writing this, The Rage of Innocence, what did it reveal for you personally and professionally?
Wow. Thank you so much, Madalena. What a powerful question. And interestingly enough, I think my answer to that, actually speaks to your question of what did the writing reveal for you? Number one, it really helped me realize that I, in some ways, was complicit. Or at a minimum, forced me to ask myself, in what ways have I been complicit, even as a defense attorney, even as someone appointed to stand in the gap, right, between my clients and the arm of the state, the power of the state. And what I realized, right, was there was complicity in so many ways, the ways in which I was not interrupting bias, right? I think in a lot of ways, I hope I've been interrupting bias just by being a zealous advocate, but I'm pushing us somewhere else. Like, I wasn't naming race. In the 26 years that I have been representing clients, it's only been in sort of the last quarter of that, right, that I really became intentional about naming race, racial bias, and racial injustice on behalf of individual clients and individual cases. It wasn't until sort of the last sort of, 8 to 10 years that I really went on the road, trying to educate judges, prosecutors, defenders, probation officers, police officers about this racial injustice that I was seeing. I think it wasn't until the last 10 years that I realized that even some of the language, and I know we may talk about language later, but the ways in which the language that I used, right, was even, buying into or perpetuating some of the stereotypes. So I think that was a wake-up call. Doing this work of this writing was important for me as an advocate and as a defender. And it was quite painful to realize, wow, I too am a part of this system unless I am directly challenge it. It also helped me, I think the writing of this book helped me really revisit and understand at a much deeper level the trauma that my clients experience in the system. And so, look, I think I knew it, right? Like, I thought I understood what it was like, to be a Black child traumatized. And it wasn't until I sat down to write this book and I went back through some of my old files to figure out what stories that I wanted to tell. I have to tell you, I had nightmares. I spent a lot of time crying, realizing, wow, this was so intense. And tragic for so many of the families. And I invite others who are in this space to do this. I started creating a long time ago, when I was still at the DC Public Defender Service, I started creating what I call a shock and awe file. A shock and awe file. And what that was a collection of police reports that I thought, or it didn't have to be police report, court files, something from a case that really caused me shock. Right? Like, why is this in the system? And so when I went back to write the book, I looked at that, right? And I was like, wow, these stories are coming up for me and I'm experiencing some level of secondary trauma just from the rereading. And I thought, how much more trauma did my clients experience? And so the reason I like to share the shock and awe folder is that we should all be doing this. We should never become complicit. We should never, accept the day-to-day routine of the work that we do, whether it's as teachers, counselors, lawyers, whatever it is. We need to be alert. And I got to tell you, when I started that shock and awe file, I never thought I was writing a book. I wasn't keeping it to write a book, but it was there for me when the time came. And finally, I think writing this book made me realize people needed to hear these stories. These are the stories that needed to be told. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up the point that by hearing the stories and getting more background and understanding, it provides some of the suggestions that you make for teachers or for police officers that by walking in their shoes, stepping outside of what we know, we can see and then better understand why or how we got here. And so that was a key takeaway for me, that I just thought, if only there was this kind of master list that we could compile of books and or resources that new law students, or like when I was a teacher going into the, Title I schools, I had no idea some of the traumas and issues that these students were encountering on a daily basis. So it just would have helped, right, to have a little more support before entering. And I know that that can certainly be that default of, well, I didn't know, but we can take the time to learn. And I think that's what matters and makes a difference. So, another question that I had for readers that haven't read your book yet, what key takeaways do you want them to know and or remember about your book that will be helpful to spread the word and or even reread this if that's something that they would want to do?
Yeah, I love that. Also, your comment just now about it would have been great to have a list and to just know more. And so I really, maybe that's a great place to start. I applaud all of you for coming to a webinar like this. You get an announcement and says the topic is the criminalization of Black youth, and you showed up, right? So it's all about the ways in which you take advantage of moments like this to educate yourselves and to learn, about the plight that our Black children are experiencing in our country. And so that's a great starting point in terms of the takeaways that I want for folks to have is, one, I want people to see themselves in the stories that I tell. That's a key takeaway. I want you to see yourself in your in your adolescence, right? In these stories, or to see your children in these stories and remember that I too did those things and I came out just fine, right? And that normal adolescent behavior, even when it appears or is disapproved by adults, is healthy and productive, right? For young people. Even, this is going to sound radical to some of you, right? But not to others, right? But even like experimenting with drugs, that's not addictive, right? But experimenting with drugs is like a way of like testing limits, pushing yourselves beyond the boundaries. And that's actually what makes some of the most successful people who tested limits, broke the rules for a moment to figure out what was appropriate and not appropriate for themselves, right? Those are some of our leaders that we have today. So understanding and seeing yourself and your normal adolescence in these stories. I think another takeaway is urging all of us to check our own biases, right? The ways in which we ourselves walk down the street, walk into a park, and we see Black children and we're afraid, right? Why is that? So check our own biases. I wanted people to really understand, as a takeaway, that trauma piece, right? The traumatic effects of criminalizing Black children was really, really important for me. I think another real important takeaway is that everyone has a role. Wherever you sit, whether it's a preacher, a teacher, minister, lay minister in the church, every single person has a role to play in disrupting the criminalization of Black youth. And so those are some of the key takeaways that we can explore here or that you will read about in my book.
Absolutely. And there were a lot, right? So thank you for narrowing down some of them for us. And as you mentioned earlier, language and how we talk about some of these scenarios, these stories, telling those stories. And I note that we have a phrase that says, choose your words carefully. And I'm certainly someone that wants to really think about what I'm saying and how I'm saying it. And in your book, you write about the juvenile and criminal legal system versus the juvenile and criminal justice system. And I just wonder if that was intentional, or if we can talk about the importance of language when it comes to these systems, and or how you decided to structure the messaging and content of your book.
Absolutely. I'm on a rampage on this topic. So you stepped into that. Language matters, absolutely matters, right? we at the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic, in partnership with the Galt Center and with the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and in partnership with the Fair and Just Prosecution Project, developed a language guide called What's Underneath. And I think one of my colleagues will drop that in the chat. But this language guide really calls attention to the language that we use in both the juvenile legal and the criminal legal system that is dehumanizing of young people. And language matters because it subconsciously, feeds or drives our treatment of the people with whom we engage, right? So if I'm using dehumanizing language, right, it is easier for me to sentence someone as an adult, sentence a child as an adult. So it's easy for me to forget the humanity and the dignity of the person that I have treated as an animal. So I think about words words that'll be obvious, thinking about calling young people thugs and, even, words that seem more, pedantic, for lack of better words, but words like offender, perpetrator, even those words are problematic because we know that nobody is defined by, or nobody's as bad as the worst thing they've ever done. We've heard that before, right? And so speaking of someone as if the word offender or perpetrator defines them is problematic. Think about this. So the word juvenile is a horrible word. I have been trying to get, me and along with some other folks, really been trying to get folks across the country to stop using the word juvenile. It's one thing to talk about the juvenile legal system. It's another thing to talk about the juvenile came to court today. And so when I train police officers, I say to them, look, we did some research on the word juvenile. The word juvenile is only used in negative context, like juvenile diabetes, a disease, juvenile male, as if a horse, right? Or juvenile delinquent, right? And it's become so pejorative. And so we need to talk about children by their first name. We need to talk about children, as youth, right? So all of that matters. And then you ask me, so yes, we keep juvenile legal system because that's, very much what the system is, but it's not a juvenile justice system. It's not a system of justice. It's a legal carceral system. And so we need to be mindful of that. The last example I'll give on language is even like this notion of the ways in which we dehumanize. Think about, you go to court and people talk about a child and they say the mother and the father and the uncle and the guardian, as if those family members are inanimate objects. No, we've got to name everyone in the system. So it sounds like such a minor point, but it is a powerful point because it translates in to our perceptions of humanity of other people. So we've really gotten on the road and tried to do trainings with folks about changing the language that we use in the system.
I agree. And it's certainly something that I was reading an article from England, I think, or London, and that was the language. They said thugs arrested for, and I'm thinking, this is 2022. Why? And I didn't even need to see the, images of these, suspects and who they were writing about and the crimes that they had allegedly committed. I mean, it was just from that alone, we knew what the direction was. And so I think when it comes to this day and age where, everyone's on their social media accounts or what they're wearing, right? Like it sends a message and or says something about either what you think or how you feel. And we know that the media plays a large part in those messages. And so I wanted to jump down to something that really, if anyone hasn't read it, but Marlon Brando's Best Actor Acceptance speech that he prepared in 1973 for the Academy Awards. I recently reread it and was blown away by the similarities of what he spoke about in regards to the mistreatment and misrepresentation of Native Americans in the motion picture arena, and how that unfortunately has aligned with how media conveys the Black youth, men and women, and how they've been stereotyped and or ostracized over time in America. So, you spoke about it in your book a little bit, but in what ways do you believe the media can shift the narrative that has subtly and overtly helped shape the ways in which the public views and reacts to the themes you mentioned in your book?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I actually had the privilege of joining or speaking at a webinar with the Associated Church Press, and we delved into this question, this notion of what can the press be doing about shifting the narrative, because that's really what it's about. Like, how do we shift the narrative, and how do we resist, right, the dehumanizing and harmful language and narrative that's been used about Black and brown children, throughout our country. And so, in preparation for that, I sort of came up with some, top tips, right? One of the things is really learning, right? Every, person in the media, whether it's, television, Hollywood, news, written paper, is got to learn how the criminal legal system really works, right? Absolutely. Having informational meetings with folks in the system, on the ground, defenders, criminologists, impacted families, right? To understand how the system works, period, right? So that so much of what gets reported in the media is the sensationalized excerpts, right, from the entire story, right? So learning how the system works, and then also learning what we call, I like to call a deep dive, taking a deep dive into the case, not accepting the first version that you get, whether the first version put out by the police. And even if the police don't mean it to be a misrepresentation, they're reporting what they learned first, right? Without that deeper dive, but that reporters have a deep obligation to dig deeper, right, into their stories, and understanding, and particularly when adolescents are involved. I say you've got to have a healthy skepticism about initial reports. Seek to understand the full context, and then remember everything that we know about adolescent development, right? All the things that I talked about, impulsivity, sensation seeking, right? So I think that's a really important part. And then committing and pledging to tell the whole story, not just pieces of the story, right? And that includes the historical relevance, right? So these pieces about, the history of racism and how that might be affecting the initial accounts and initial perceptions of the crime, all of that needs to come out, right? Exposing for the audience the collateral implications and the collateral impacts of systems involvement. All of that is a part of the whole story. I think the other piece is, particularly right now, as we sit in a moment like, whatever stage of the pandemic we want to call ourselves, right? That we are, living with a lot of trauma. And we're seeing in some cities an uptick in crime. And people, when we report about crime, it is essential to look at the long trends, right? And resist the inflammatory responses to a temporary uptick or high profile incidents of crime. We've got to report on the long trends, right? So thinking about like the super predator myth that grew out of the surge of crime in the late 80s and early 90s, that became the language that drove so much. I cannot tell you how impactful the media was in driving what we see today, still today, the prosecution of children as adults, the incarceration of children as adults. I hold the media in many ways co-responsible for that legacy, for that outcome, because of that super predator narrative that was pushed. It wasn't introduced, by the media, but that was pushed, that was carried so much further than it might have been. So I'll stop there, but those are just some examples of the ways in which the media can shift the narrative. And I think, Marlon Brando is right, about that, how impactful the perceptions, the media perceptions are.
Absolutely. And I think it just compounds the situation, right? That what we either grow up hearing, grow up seeing, grow up living, it just adds to the many layers of either a false narrative or the story as we know it, right? Like, I don't know any other experience other than this is what I see, this is what my family knows, this is how life is. So I think it's that 360 effort where we need to be looking at it from all angles. And obviously the media and social media is, for better or worse, driving that, as you said. And so, there are certainly other topics that we want to dive into. I know Theo's going to come in and start talking about some of these solutions. And I think for me as an educator, I certainly look at this from that lens, right? Like, how can we support students, or how can we, from the school position, either do more and be more for these students. And I know in your book, I've bookmarked so many pages and the library is going to kill me, but I just was blown away by some of the statistics in regards to the money that we put in the direction of resource officers, or how much we could redistribute those funds, right, to mental health and social workers and other advocates that can support young people that are experiencing all of these things. So I'll turn it over to Theo to kind of dive into some of those topics with you and hear from you what solutions that you think we could start with, right? Whether it's the bottom up, is it the top down from a policy position? Is it the outside in, getting better community relationships? Is it the inside out, working with young people to really get that representation and advocacy and mentoring that they need? So lots of questions, but welcome back, Theo.
No, and maybe some of all of those. I think I would just say, Kris, once you pick up on the point she raised about resource officers, you write in your book a lot about cops in schools and all the resources there. And you have some suggestions for reform in that area. And I think you point out, as Madalena said in one point, the amount of money we spend on resource officers versus other things. To come pick up a little on that general theme, and what do we most need to know, you think, about resource officers or police in schools, and how would you change that to make it better?
Absolutely. So I think one of my general reforms, like I often lead with, is that we have to radically reduce the footprint of police in the lives of our children, period, right? And that one of the ways in which we get there is through police-free schools. And I have to tell you, police-free schools is not as radical as it sounds, all right? I'm not saying that police will never be involved in, in incidents or managing or responding to incidents of police violence. What I am saying is that we do not need police physically present in the day-to-day operations of schools, right? And that police officers, and look, we've seen enough evidence recently with Uvalde and other schools shootings that police presence does not prevent the types of mass shootings and violence that we are trying to prevent with the police presence. And that police officers historically and today are designed or trained to investigate after the fact. So then the question all of you are wondering is like, Lord have mercy, what does she want us to do? There are solutions, right? We have law enforcement in our schools because we have bought into the false sort of dichotomy or this false claim that the only way to keep our schools safe is through police officers. And it's just not true. And so what we need to do is to adopt a holistic public health approach to school safety and to public safety. So what in the world does that look like? It means an approach that is attentive to the relationships between children and adults, meaningful, healthy mentoring relationships. It means a framework that is trauma-informed, that recognize that children enter that front door of that school and are bringing with them traumas. And so that we need to be ready and able to respond to that. We also need a framework that is restorative, that seeks to repair relationships between children, between children, different groups of children, relationships that have been broken. And we need a framework that is racially just. So for those of you who are asking on a much more practical level, what does that look like in schools? It means we need a continuum of mental health providers in the school system, right? Reallocating our police dollars, reimagining policing, and allowing police officers to do what they are uniquely trained to do. And on that list is not raising adolescents, right? That's not what police officers are trained to do. And so instead, we need this continuum of mental health providers that are culturally competent, right? We need counselors in the schools. We need social workers in the schools. We need peer interventions in our school system. We also need social emotional learning. That is a curriculum that allows, that teaches young people empathy, compassion, right? Loyalty, how to resolve conflict. All of that needs to be in the school system. In those schools where there is real evidence of violence and not the kind of violence that we want to label my client Sharice with, like, when there's real violence, we need violence interrupters and credible messengers. Those are folks who look like the children themselves, who look like Black and brown children, maybe who've been system involved and who can engage and relate to those children at their level.
What else have you seen in that regard of things that work? I know there's a question, Janet Lipscomb has a question about restorative justice. You mentioned that in your book as something, and just other things that you've seen that work effectively to address dangers of violence and to alternatives to just strict policing as a way of dealing with the
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, it's a great question. All the things on my list are evidence-based. And by that, I mean that they've been, evaluated, they've been implemented, tried, and evaluated with varying jurisdictions, meaning various cities and states with different types of populations. And so restorative justice, I think, is a perfect example. In fact, I was on a panel earlier today with we're right here in Washington, D.C., from the Office of the Attorney General. They have an extraordinarily successful restorative justice program, and that is well implemented. I got to say, a lot of people, I'm going to be really clear about this, across the country say they have a restorative justice program, and it's not really, but that it is, a circle in which they bring young people together with their with the person that they've harmed. The restorative justice programs that work are understanding and respectful of adolescence, right? They seek a balanced conversation. It's not a conversation where you bring all the adults in the room, the victims in the room, and you yell at the kid and tell the kid that they're wrong. A true restorative justice program seeks to understand how it is that the kid got here, right? What it is that the kid has experienced, him or her or themselves, in these moments, right? And letting the victim share their harm and their hurt, and let them come to a place of mutual understanding. I also have to tell you what's so important about the restorative justice program that Carl Racine and Seema Gajwani from the Office of Attorney General in the District of Columbia is that they've learned how to use restorative justice, not just in the low-level misdemeanor, minor offenses, but they use restorative justice in the much more serious cases, right? In cases, involving some serious violent felonies even, and how extraordinarily impactful that is. So because the goal has to be, right, restoring or repairing harm, and establishing humanity, right, across the table. And you need that in the most serious cases, not just in the misdemeanors.
You mentioned some of the things going on in DC, and one of the questions is from John Quinn, who's an attorney at New York Avenue Church. And he says he's read that the DC government is reviewing and revising its criminal code. And he wants to know if there's some group or people engaging in this that are sensitive to the kind of facts and research you're talking about. I don't know if you're aware of that particular effort, but maybe the broader question is criminal codes, and what are some examples of adjustments that should be made in terms of dealing with children?
Yeah, and so, it's a really good question that was posed about DC. And yes, DC is taking a look. They look first at, the sentencing reform and taking a look now at codes. And what I don't know, and this really goes to the second part of your question, Theo, is to what extent, right, that committee, right, that has been, or the commission has been set aside to look at criminal offenses, to what extent that adolescent development issues and children's issues are adequately being attended to. And so I will, I can give some examples of things that really need to be revisited. I talk about in the book a bit, the decriminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. And so what do I mean by that? Think about a threats charge, right? A threat to do bodily harm. And then ask yourself, right? How many of you told your parent, I hate you, or I'm going to kill you, or, right? That's a threat, right? That meets the elements of an offense, but that's really adolescent aggressive speech. Is that the type of criminal offense or type of behavior that we want to label as a criminal offense, right? Think about disorderly conduct. Disorderly conduct, if you looked it up in the definition in a Webster's dictionary, it should have a picture of a teenager, right? That's by definition, right? So thinking about that, thinking about similarly loitering charges, think about simple assaults. No, I don't want children fighting, right? But think about the average school fight. Is that simple assault? Right? Should we be bringing those children to court for that? And then we do not, fortunately, have this offense in the District of Columbia, but there's a statute on the books in some parts of our country, including South Carolina. And for those of you who remember the young girl, Shakira Murphy, who was playing on, or allegedly, she was looking at her cell phone in math class. And the math teacher got upset, calls in the school resource officer, called a deputy. The deputy literally yanks her out of her seat, flips her over backwards. And that was all over the media. Well, she got arrested and charged, among other things, with disturbing schools, right? Her classmate who was watching and filming this, which is why we all know about this story, she also, Naya Kinney, also got charged with disturbing schools. That is an offense that should be absolutely radically, eliminated from statutes all across the country, right? There are other states that have this statute. And again, it's another statute by definition, children getting arrested for, farting in class, right? Laughing when they're supposed to be playing or supposed to be studying. All of that we all did as kids, get arrested and traumatized. And again, what did I say? Over policing, over criminalizing adolescents actually increases crime, not reduces crime.
I first met you when several years ago when you were active at Metropolitan AME. I know you're still involved in church community. Just say a little bit about how your faith intersects with your work, and any understanding or insights you get from your faith that help you in this work that you do.
Absolutely. I'm going to tell you, my faith is 100% what sustains me in this work in so many ways, right? And I really, the word grace is, I got to tell you, I don't know that I go through a conversation about this book where I don't talk about grace. And when I'm talking about grace, and I've already said it, right? I talked about the ways in which we treat and we view and we engage with white youth with grace and tolerance, right? And we don't do the same for Black youth. And so, I'll go back to Madalena. You asked one of the takeaways. I want us to have grace, right? Grace for Black youth. And I think I understand that concept and that frame from my faith. I also, and this notions of humanity, right? And treating people with dignity and respect arises out of everything that I learned from my faith. What would Jesus do? Literally, treating people with humanity. I think about faith also, and I do not mean to be trite and repeat a phrase that we've all heard so often, but when I get down and I feel the weight of the system against my clients, I think about the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That is my mantra that runs through my head, because it allows me to recognize that even, when this one case isn't going the way that it is, that my everyday involvement with the young people that I serve has a longer term impact, right? It's not only impacting that one individual child and that one individual family over the long time. They might not even see it that day themselves, but my hope is, right, that I've made the system a little less traumatic for them, but that also that the judges are watching and prosecutors are watching, and that slowly we are shifting the tide. And so that's why, we talked earlier about, my work at Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic. All of the training, when I became intentional about naming race and racial injustice and realizing that we had to go on the road with that, that's about that, that long arc towards justice. Slowly but surely educating folks has got to be done one day at a time.
It's nice to hear you see some sort of shifting tide. Say a little bit more about maybe progress you've seen. We get so down on the size of the problems, but in the 25 years you've been working on this, and what would you point to as progress we've made, awareness about certain kinds of issues? Just briefly, a few things like that.
Yeah.
Give us hope we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, so I will say there are a couple of things that provide me the greatest sense of hope and optimism. And I think one of them is the resilience of children. Madalena referred to the last chapter of my book, is chapter 12, and I call it Black Boy Joy and Black Girl Magic, the resilience of Black adolescents, precisely because, right, of the resilience, notwithstanding the trauma that we've been talking about. If we give them support, we point them in the right direction, then we really can cultivate that resilience. So teachers, parents, community members, all of us, the church has a role to play in that resilience. I think the other thing that gives me hope is the moments after the death of George Floyd. I hate that it took a 9-minute video to cause that kind of outrage, but it did. International outrage, domestic outrage. And I have to say, our attention to these issues has increased tenfold as a result. And I know that from the outreach that I get in my center at the Juvenile Justice Clinic, invitations to speak and to talk about these issues literally almost overnight, quadrupled because folks are interested, and from unlikely places, right? From places where you would not expect folks to make that phone call and want to have that conversation. So I think that's a space that I'm seeing it.
Good. I have a couple of other things from people about what people can do, but I want to see, Madalena, if you have another question you want to ask here before I move us toward closing with a couple of questions about what we can do here.
Sure. No, I certainly have lots of questions, but I think it would be great for folks to hear, and you certainly touch on that in your book, about your hope for your clients and obviously overall. And my question was, and you certainly spoke about one of your clients, Eric, there in the final chapter. But you mentioned one client by the name of Kevin. And on page 235, you wrote, as Kevin passes his 18th birthday, I am hopeful. I have every reason to believe that Kevin will age out of crime naturally, just as developmental research says he will. So I was just curious to know how Kevin's doing, and or, over, the 2+ decades that you've been doing this work, that obviously keeps you doing it because of your faith and because of these young people, what you can share with us either about Kevin or Eric or any of the other clients that you mentioned.
Yeah, and so, this is a good reminder that it's a time for another check-in with both Kevin and Eric to see how they're doing now. So, it's periodic, it's incremental. One of the things, so the last time I talked to both of them, they were both doing well, right? Both, and not, too long ago, but doing well. Eric in particular, becoming an activist in his own way, right? Kevin, getting a job and becoming a father and caring for his own child, right? And so that one of the things that I really want to highlight in your question is the research showing that children naturally age out. They naturally age out of criminal behavior, and we have to own that. Even serious crime, right? The research shows that there is what we call a crime bump in adolescence, where kids, when they're children, they play and they're frolicking and they're fine, and they become teenagers and they take those risks, and we see all kinds of increase in crime temporarily, and then it just literally plummets almost on a straight line, as teenagers begin to age out. And so this is going to be a radical statement. Even if we did nothing, if we did absolutely nothing, we did no intervention, on behalf of children or into the lives of children who have committed crime, we might actually come out better as a society than intervening the wrong way, right? In the lives of children, like solitary confinement, incarcerating them with adults, right? Labeling them as delinquent and excluding them from school through suspensions and discipline, that we're doing it wrong. But yes, just really wanted to highlight that, the aging out.
Thank you.
There are a few questions. There really are some excellent ones. We'll try to save these and let you look at them. I know it's always interesting what kind of questions people come up with. There are a couple about what people can do, and they're sort of mention them both, and you can comment on them. One is from Celeste Bryant, who I think who actually was the first person who told me about your book. Yes. So thank you, Celeste, for that. She just says, what's the responsibility of those of us who are not in the legal area or not legal advocates, and addressing these issues locally with schools, or what can average citizens' parents do? And then another question by Kit Arrington. It says, you mentioned some of the things that can bring about change. What 3 things do you think could be most impactful for making change? So maybe address a little what individuals can do, and then if you could just make 3 changes, what would those be?
Yeah. Oh, that's hard. That latter one's hard. So I'll give the longer, not longer, I'll just list them for you. What can individuals do? First of all, thank you, Celeste Bryant. I love you. I just had to say that. I really, really appreciate you. And in terms of what can individuals who are not in the legal system, I say all the time, every single one of us who lives in this country, no matter what seat you occupy, I'll say it over and over again, has a role to play in interrupting the criminalization of Black youth. Truly getting proximate, right? That's that word that we talk about in this space, getting proximate to the young people who are impacted, right? So whether that is, becoming a mentor, tutoring a young child, somebody completely outside of your class and outside of your race, or and asking them, how they're doing, that simple question, understanding what it's like to get up to go to school, and to what is it like to encounter the police? What are you most afraid of? What are you most excited about? But getting proximate, right? And that ties to something that I said earlier, which is allowing us to check our bias, right? We have to check our own biases, and that's intra-race, right, as well as across races, right? And by getting proximate, we get to see that joy and that laughter of Black children, and it begins to help us shed some of those stereotypes and assumptions. On a much more sort of systems reform level, we need to pay attention to local elections, the local elections of our prosecutors across the country, right? Local elections of juvenile court judges in jurisdictions where the judge is elected, right? We need to be out front and advocating and making sure youth justice issues are at the forefront. We need to be in front of our city lawmakers advocating for smaller class sizes, right? Smaller class sizes actually reduces, crime in our society. Advocating for resources that children need, and advocating, in my view, for police-free schools. But if you're not yet comfortable with that, slowly and incrementally advocating for an increase in mental health services in your school. The voice of the community is powerful. And as you talked about, Theo, when I was active in Metropolitan, we would go to city council, we would testify on youth justice bills, and we could fill that room with people from churches across the country. And the church voice, right, the faith community voice matters, right? Opening our doors as a church community, as a faith-based community, to children with sagging pants. Sorry, right? Children who fit the stereotypes, right? Meeting kids where they are is really impactful. I don't know, Theo, if I can give you the three. I think all of those are so incredibly important. Can I give you my top three? It's reducing the footprint of police in the lives of children, decriminalizing normal adolescent behaviors, and where in those rare circumstances that police officers are needed in the lives of children, we have got to train police officers to de-escalate. We have to train police officers in adolescent development and and racial bias, right? Like, that's critical, right? It's not the end all be all, but it's important in the meantime until we radically reduce the footprint of police.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I had as my last question to ask you what final message you wanted to leave with us. You may have just done that in terms of summarizing so many good things, but let me just ask you, as we close, and then we're going to share some information about your work also a little bit, and that if you just say a little bit about the work you do at the clinic and initiative, and just any other final words you want to leave with folks before we share some information at the end.
Yeah, so I'll just say, maybe I'll say a word about the work at Georgetown real quickly, and then I'll end with what I hope you'll walk away with. And I think just, to let folks know, we are indeed, the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative. Although we are housed inside of a law school, we are truly a legal services organization, right? And there are ways for you guys to get involved and to support our work. And in a moment, Theo will share slides of how you can contact us, how you can support the work that we're doing. Our mission, our focus right now is a racial justice frame, right? We are on a mission across the country through all the things that I've talked about. We provide direct representation to children in Washington, D.C. We do friend of the court briefs across the country, wherever you are. We do consultation and technical support across across the country. We do trainings and speaking engagements across the country to educate churches, right? County leaders. So you can reach out to us. We can help with that. We do resource development. We can send you resources about how to make these arguments in your jurisdiction. So that's the work of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative. I'm sure I'm missing more, but when we give you the website, we'll let you know. I think my parting words are this, right? Which is that if you take nothing else from this conversation, it is that Black children are children too, and that every single one of us has a role to play. And one of my psychologist friends said something to me that I've never forgotten, which is that every single child in this country deserves, needs at least one irrationally caring adult in their life. And that children would do even better with a team of irrationally caring adults, and that all of us can be that, right? We know that children make mistakes, and we made mistakes, and that we're not going to shame our children, embarrass our children, label our children, incarcerate our children, but we're going to redirect them and love them and support them. That's what it means to be an irrationally caring adult.
Thank you, Kris, so much. Thank you. This is the point at which, if we were in person, I would ask for a big round of applause, and I'm sure we would get it. That's one of the problems with webinars. We can't clap together and laugh together, but it's so, thank you for sharing all of that. We've been glad to have all of you with us this evening. And as we do close, I want to just say I hope you've learned a lot tonight, and I want to pose a question for you to think about. What insights did you gain tonight that were most helpful for you? I invite you to think about this and then type it into chat. I've found that if I stop at the end of a presentation and really think what I've learned, it helps me to carry it forward and maybe even act on it at some point. So take a moment and type into chat particular insights you got from Kris and the discussion with her, some of the questions that were asked. As you type those in, I have a few brief announcements I want to share. As Kris indicated, partly some more about her work. But the first thing is I want to urge you to buy The Rage of Innocence. I guess you can borrow it from a friend who already has it, but I recommend you buy it and sit with it, learn about it. And there's a lot of powerful information there that will help you to more understand this really complex and important problem. Second, here is the information on Kris Henning and her colleagues and the work they do at Georgetown. You see the ways to participate. You see the various social media ways to connect. There's a lot of information here. You might want to take a picture of this slide if you want to see how to interact with them so you can look at it later. But this, and you can go to the website and learn more about the work that Kris was describing there. So again, this is the access if you want to know more on that. Third, here are some other organizations that Kris suggested to us that do work with children, with youth. One I'm particularly familiar with is the Free Minds Book Club, which we work with. And I know of these other groups, and they do excellent work. Some others in chat may be putting other resources. You can keep your eye on that. But again, you may want to get these websites, take a picture of the slide or something if you want to do more research later on, because there are a number of groups doing really good work in this area, both in Washington, D.C. And around the country. Next, the fourth brief announcement is I do want to remind you about the Returning Citizens Assistance Network and what we do. We're a group of 20 congregations in Washington. We work directly with the Public Defender Service, and we assist their clients who are struggling and working in different ways to reenter society. And if you're interested in knowing more about how we help folks, you see an email address there. DCRCan2018@gmail, and Madalena and or I or someone else can get back to you. we help folks in a variety of ways with emergencies around food, clothing. We help with housing. We have situations where we mentor folks and try to assist them in getting jobs, a whole range of ways. And if you're interested in being involved or would like to get your congregation involved, if they're not already, then please be in touch with us. Glad to tell you more about that also. And fifth and finally, for my announcements, I want to let you know the next McClendon Scholar program will be Thursday evening, December 8th. It'll be a really interesting panel discussion about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his importance today. If you don't know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who was ultimately killed by the Nazis for his work inside Germany, resisting Hitler, he's a wonderful story, a brilliant man, and there is a film about his life that has run on PBS, and it's an excellent overview of his life and particularly how it's relevant for us today. And we're going to be making the film available in a variety of ways. We'll tell you about this. And then on December 8th, we'll have a panel discussion with the filmmaker and some other experts on Bonhoeffer who I think will really make that come alive. You can learn more about all our programs at the McClendon Scholar page at the New York Avenue website. And it has recordings of almost every former program. There will be a recording of this program up on our website and on YouTube in the next 2 or 3 days. So you can go to that site, nyapc.org/McClendon-SIR to see this again if you want, or to look back at some part, and also it has information on upcoming programs. Well, thank you again, Professor Kris Henning, and your lively and enthusiastic presentation. And I've benefited from it, just being around your positive energy and your enthusiasm and your compassion for your clients is inspiring. I want to close with a quote from your book, Kris, which speaks to the issue you talked about what we can all do and having adults in the lives of children, how it can make a difference. And you say this near the end of your book: Black children have a good chance of thriving as adults, even if they've experienced difficult circumstances, but usually only if we help them get there. We means all of us: parents, teachers, mentors, social workers, pediatricians, mental health workers, faith leaders, athletic coaches, community activists, lawmakers, government officials, and the media. Young people who have sustained contact with a community of advocates who keep them safe and make them feel as if they belong have a much better chance of fighting off self-defeating attitudes and navigating the threats they face in society. Thank you, Kris, for that thought and all else you've shared. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and good evening.